It was 1968 when the letter arrived. I still remember the envelope, plain and official, the kind you do not want to see in your mailbox. It carried the voice of Uncle Sam, summoning me into the United States Army. I was only 20 years old, barely stepping into manhood, and suddenly my entire future was being rewritten in black ink on government stationery. At the time, I had been married to my wife, Tony Jane, for 3 years. We were young, hopeful, and still learning what it meant to build a life together. We had dreamed of children, but fate had dealt us a cruel blow when she miscarried. That loss left an emptiness in our home, a quiet reminder that life can be taken away before it even begins. In many ways, that sadness prepared me for what was coming, though I did not know it then. Life before the war was simple. I worked, I loved my wife, and I carried the ordinary dreams of a small-town boy. I thought the future would be about family dinners, raising kids, maybe buying a house. Never once did I imagine that within months I would be standing in a war zone on the other side of the world, staring death in the face. When the draft pulled me in, I found myself in Columbia, South Carolina, in a room filled with young men just like me, boys really. Some looked nervous, some tried to act tough, but all of us knew this was bigger than anything we had ever faced. A sergeant stood before us, eyes sharp, voice firm. He asked if any of us would like to join the Marine Corps instead of the Army. For a moment, the room was quiet. Then I raised my hand. Only a few others did the same. Why did I do it? Because my best friend in high school, Dennis Michael from Vacaville, California, had joined the Marines. Earlier that year he was killed in Hugh City during the Tet Offensive. His death burned inside me like a fire I could not put out. At 20 years old, with grief clouding my judgment, I thought the only way to honor him was to follow in his footsteps and avenge his death. I was not thinking about politics or history or whether the war was right or wrong. At that moment, all I knew was that my friend was gone, and I wanted to face the same enemy he had faced. I wanted to carry a rifle where he had fallen. Looking back now, I see how young and reckless that decision was, but at the time it felt like the only choice I could make. The sergeant's question was simple, but the weight of my raised hand was immense. That small gesture sealed my fate. I was no longer just a drafted soldier. I was a Marine, and that meant something different. It meant tougher training, harsher battles, and a reputation for being the first in and the last out. It meant stepping into the very heart of the war. As I stood there among the other recruits, I felt both pride and fear. Pride that I was strong enough to choose the path of the Marines. Fear because deep down, I knew it would demand more from me than I could ever imagine. And so, in that crowded room in South Carolina, my life shifted forever. One hand raised in the air, one decision made in anger and grief. In that moment, with my hand lifted high, I gambled away my entire life. The flight into Vietnam did not feel like a journey into a war. We were on a commercial plane, packed into seats that once carried tourists and businessmen. The seats were worn, the smell of old upholstery lingering, and yet for me, every breath carried a weight. I sat there staring out the window, wondering what the ground would look like when we landed. Would it be like the newsreels? Would it feel real, or would it still seem like something happening to other people far away? As we descended toward Da Nang, I could feel my pulse quickening. The coastline appeared first, green hills rolling down to the edge of the sea. It looked beautiful, almost peaceful, and for a moment I thought perhaps the war had been exaggerated in my mind. But beauty is a cruel mask for violence. The wheels touched down, and within minutes the illusion shattered. We had not even been given weapons yet. We were still just young men in uniforms, clutching duffel bags, adjusting to the humid air that clung to our skin like a wet blanket. The heat was suffocating, thicker than anything I had known back home. And then it came, the first rocket attack. The sirens wailed, loud and piercing, slicing through the chatter of new arrivals. Explosions thundered somewhere beyond the runway, sending vibrations through the ground beneath my boots. A second later, another blast shook the air, the sound tearing into my ears and rattling my chest. The sky that had seemed so calm when we landed was suddenly filled with smoke trails and echoes of destruction. Chaos erupted. Some men dropped their bags and sprinted. Others froze in place, wide-eyed as if rooted to the spot. I was one of those caught between running and standing, unsure of what to do. A Marine near me, someone only a few years older, pushed me toward a bunker. "Move!" he shouted, his voice breaking with urgency. We tumbled into a trench, dirt and sandbags forming a fragile shield around us. I could smell the acrid sting of burning fuel in the air. My throat tightened as the smoke mixed with the heavy humidity. Beside me, another recruit was trembling, his hands clasped together as he made the sign of the cross. His lips moved silently in prayer, and I realized he was begging God to spare him. I stared at him, then at the sky above, where the sound of rockets whistled closer and closer. Fear wrapped around me like chains. I thought of my wife, of the life I had left behind, and I wondered how long I could survive in this place. 20 minutes. That was all it had taken to strip away every ounce of innocence I carried with me from home. In just 20 minutes on Vietnamese soil, I had aged 20 years. The attack lasted only minutes, but it stretched in my mind like an eternity. Every explosion carved itself into my memory, every tremor in the earth felt like a warning that the ground itself was trying to swallow me whole. When the barrage finally ceased, silence did not bring relief. It brought a heavy, suffocating realization. This was only the beginning. We climbed out of the trench, still shaky, our uniforms smeared with dirt. Some men tried to laugh it off, though the laughter sounded hollow, forced, like they were trying to convince themselves it was nothing. Others remained pale, their eyes locked on the horizon as if expecting the next rocket at any moment. I tried to steady my breathing, but my chest still heaved with panic. My hands trembled as I picked up my bag, pretending it was just from exertion, though deep down I knew it was fear. We had not even been issued rifles yet. The absurdity struck me. We had been thrown into the middle of a war zone with nothing but our uniforms and prayers. I remember looking around at the men beside me, realizing that every one of us was facing the same terrifying truth. Some whispered to themselves. Some cursed under their breath. One young man sat down in the dirt, staring at nothing as if his spirit had already left him. In that moment, I understood that the war was not something that would wait for us to adjust. It was immediate, brutal, and merciless. The older Marines who had come to guide us looked different from us. Their eyes carried a weight I could not yet comprehend. They moved with calm efficiency, shouting orders, directing us to safer ground as though rocket fire were nothing new. I wondered how long it would take before I looked like them, before the shock faded and the terror turned into something harder, something colder. That night, as we settled into the barracks, the echoes of the attack still rang in my ears. Every creak of the wooden beams, every distant thump in the dark, made me flinch. I lay awake on the cot, staring at the ceiling, feeling sweat cling to my skin. Sleep would not come. Instead, my mind replayed the sound of the rockets over and over again, each whistle and explosion as vivid as when it first happened. It was then that I realized the war would not simply test my body, it would consume my soul if I let it. I thought again of my wife, of Dennis Michael, my best friend who had died in Hue. I had come here with anger and vengeance in my heart, but as I lay there, listening to the jungle breathe outside the thin walls, I felt something else creeping in. Fear. Unrelenting, bone-deep fear. I knew I had to learn to live with it or it would destroy me. And so, my first day in Vietnam ended not with courage or triumph, but with the hollow knowledge that I was now in a place where death waited at every turn, and where survival would demand more than I had ever given before. When I was finally assigned to my unit, I learned the name that would come to define my tour in Vietnam. Delta Company. Among the Marines, it carried a grim nickname, Die in Delta. It was not said with pride, nor with mockery, but with a quiet acceptance that our company bled more than most. If you wore that patch, people expected you to come back with scars if you came back at all. The first night I spent with Delta Company stripped away whatever illusions I had left about what this war would be. The men were hardened, their faces carved by exhaustion and grief. They moved with the weariness of those who had seen too much. That night, as the sun set and the jungle swallowed the light, I saw something that still burns in my memory. A young Marine had just returned from patrol. He was lean, sweaty, his helmet tilted slightly forward. But what caught my eye was what he carried on that helmet. The scalp of a dead Viet Cong, tied to the strap and dangling like some grotesque ornament. He wore it without shame, as if it were a badge of honor, or maybe a shield against his own fear. I froze. Part of me wanted to turn away, to erase the image from my mind. But I could not. That strip of flesh, dried and stiff, told me more about this war than any briefing or newspaper could. It was savagery, pure and raw, and it had found its way into the hearts of the men who fought here. In that moment, I realized I was no longer in the world I had known. I had stepped into a place where life and death had no clear boundary, and where survival demanded a darkness I had not yet embraced. That night I lay awake, hearing the sounds of the jungle, cicadas buzzing, distant artillery thumping, the rustle of unseen creatures moving in the brush. My rifle lay across my chest, my finger brushing the trigger guard as if I could somehow ward off danger in my sleep. But sleep never came. My mind replayed the image of that scalp, swinging on the helmet strap, mocking me with the truth that I could not deny. War corrodes the soul as surely as it tears apart the body. As dawn broke, I understood that my old life had been left behind the moment I raised my hand in Columbia, South Carolina. The boy who dreamed of family dinners and quiet evenings with his wife was gone. In his place stood a Marine in Delta Company, waiting for his turn to face the fire. My first patrol with Delta Company came only days later. The sun was relentless, beating down on us as we moved in a thin line across the rice paddies. The mud sucked at our boots, slowing every step, while the water reflected the sky so brightly it felt like walking on a mirror. Each breath was thick with humidity, clinging to my skin and making my flak jacket feel twice as heavy. The landscape was beautiful if you stripped away the fear. Green fields stretched out in every direction, framed by distant mountains. But to us, those fields were not peaceful. They were open killing grounds. We all knew it. Out there on the dikes, with no cover, we might as well have been painted targets. Every grunt, whether Army or Marine, understood the same truth. When you walked across those paddies, you were one trigger pull away from eternity. Halfway across it happened. The sharp, rattling burst of AK-47 fire cut through the still air. The sound was different from anything I had heard before, harsher, faster, with a metallic bite that made your blood run cold. Down, someone shouted, but the order was unnecessary. Instinct took over. I dropped, crashing into the muddy water, the taste of earth and filth filling my mouth. The world erupted around me, bullets snapping overhead, splashing into the paddy, sending tiny geysers of water into the air. For a moment I could not move. I pressed my face into the mud, my heart pounding so violently I thought it would tear out of my chest. I remember looking up just for a second. The sky was impossibly blue, clean and endless above the chaos. "Thank you, God," I whispered, "for not letting me die yet." But as quickly as gratitude came, reality struck. I was still in the middle of that field, still pinned down by an enemy I could not see. The fight was not over, not by a long shot. My rifle was slick with mud, but I clutched it tightly, waiting for the chance to fire back. Around me, men shouted, cursed, returned fire. The air was alive with noise, rifles cracking, bullets whining, the thump of grenades exploding in the distance. And then, silence. The firefight ended as suddenly as it began. We lay there for what felt like hours, afraid to lift our heads, waiting for another burst. When we finally crawled forward, one Marine lay still, a neat hole in the center of his forehead. His helmet rested beside him, useless, unable to stop the bullet that had taken his life. I stared at him, frozen. That could have been me. Just a step to the left, a step to the right, and it would have been my blood in the paddy. I wanted to believe there was some reason, some divine hand that spared me, but deep down I knew the truth. It was chance. Blind, merciless chance. That night, back at camp, I lay awake again, unable to shake the image of the blue sky above me, the way it seemed so calm while death rained down. I realized then that in Vietnam, beauty and terror walked hand in hand. The same field that looked like paradise could become your grave in an instant. A few weeks later, I learned just how thin the line between life and death could be. We were moving cautiously along a narrow trail, the jungle pressing in on both sides, when my boot hovered over what looked like nothing more than a small round bump in the dirt. I might have stepped down without a thought, but the Marine behind me, Warren Brayton, a kid from back home who had an uncanny instinct for danger, shouted, "Stop!" I froze, one foot in the air, sweat dripping down my face. My heart slammed against my ribs as Warren knelt and brushed the dirt away with trembling hands. There it was, a pressure release trigger, connected to a buried 155mm artillery shell, repurposed into a massive landmine. Had I brought my foot down, the explosion would have torn me into 1,000 pieces. For a moment I could see it in my mind, my body ripped apart, my flesh scattered across the jungle. I imagined my guts draped across the branches of banana trees, hanging like grotesque ornaments, strands of red and gray swinging gently in the breeze. I could see my guts hanging from the trees like tinsel on a Christmas tree. The image was so vivid it nearly made me sick. I staggered back, my knees weak, as the demolitions team came forward to disarm the device. When they finally detonated it in place, the blast shook the ground like an earthquake. I realized just how close I had come to disappearing, my entire existence erased in a flash of fire and steel. That night I sat alone, staring into the darkness, unable to shake the thought, why him and not me? Just days earlier, another Marine had not been so lucky. His name was Robert Anthony, and he had stepped on a similar booby trap. The blast had left nothing recognizable, nothing for his family to bury except what they could scrape into a body bag. That could have been me. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes I saw the trees again, decorated with pieces of myself. It was not just the fear of dying that haunted me, it was the realization of how meaningless that death could be. One wrong step, one careless moment, and everything you were, everything you hoped to be, was gone. The war did not just threaten us with bullets and rockets. It stalked us silently, hidden beneath the earth, waiting for us to make a single mistake. And in Delta Company, mistakes were always paid in blood. From that day forward, I walked differently. Every step felt heavier, more deliberate, as if the ground itself were alive and plotting against me. I watched the faces of the men around me, saw the same fear etched into their eyes. We were learning quickly that survival was not just about courage or skill. It was about luck, and how long that luck could last. March 19, 1969. That date is carved into me as if it were branded by fire. We were pulled back from the jungle to a place called Liberty Bridge, a temporary base that served as battalion headquarters. Compared to the bush, it felt like heaven on earth. There were barbed wire perimeters, artillery batteries, tanks dug in, and most importantly, a chow hall where you could eat a hot meal instead of choking down sea rations in the mud. For a few days, we almost forgot we were in a war. We had showers, outhouses, real cots to sleep on. I remember sitting in the mess hall, spooning hot food into my mouth, thinking that maybe we'd get a little break. Maybe just for a while the war would pass us by. But in Vietnam, peace was always an illusion. That night, the illusion shattered. Around 2 in the morning, when the camp was asleep, the first blast shook us awake. At first, I thought it was our own artillery firing into the distance. But then the ground quaked, sandbags shifted, and the unmistakable roar of explosions tore through the night. The North Vietnamese army had come for us, and they had come prepared. The sky lit up with orange flashes as Bangalore torpedoes tore through the wire. The sound was deafening, a rolling thunder that cracked open the night. I scrambled from my cot, boots half-laced, weapon in hand, heart hammering. Outside, chaos ruled. Tracers streaked across the black sky, red and green fireflies weaving a deadly dance. And then came the flamethrowers. I will never forget the sight, the sudden gush of liquid fire spraying across the bunkers, igniting everything in its path. The screams were immediate, gut-wrenching, human voices torn apart by agony as Marines inside those bunkers were burned alive. One bunker, just yards from mine, became an inferno. The smell of burning flesh hit me, thick and suffocating, a smell I can never forget. We opened fire blindly into the darkness, trying to hold the line. Mortar rounds landed inside the wire, showering us with dirt and shrapnel. My ears rang, my body shook with every concussion. Orders were shouted, lost in the roar of gunfire. Men ran, stumbled, screamed. The enemy kept coming, relentless, slipping through the breaches torn open by their explosives. I remember crouching behind the sandbags, firing at shapes I could barely see, the barrel of my rifle glowing hot. Every few seconds the world exploded in light. Muzzle flashes, grenades, napalm bursts, and then sank back into choking blackness. My throat burned with smoke, my eyes stung, and my lungs struggled to draw air. At one point, I turned to reload and saw the bunker beside me fully engulfed, flames licking through the firing ports. The Marines inside never made it out. Their screams rose above the chaos, then fell silent as the fire consumed everything. I wanted to run to them, but I knew there was nothing I could do. The war had already claimed them. That was the beginning of the longest night of my life. The battle raged on without pause. Hours stretched like eternity, broken only by the rhythm of gunfire, explosions, and screams. My body moved on instinct, reload, fire, duck, pray, but my mind was drifting between terror and disbelief. I had seen firefights before, ambushes in the paddies, but nothing like this. This was not just combat. This was survival inside a storm of fire. Sometime before dawn, I crawled through the wreckage of a collapsed bunker to pull out wounded men. The smoke was so thick I could barely breathe. My hands shook as I grabbed at uniforms, dragging Marines who were bleeding, burned, broken. One of them was a Navy corpsman, Doc Hammond. He had been hit in the head by a sniper's round while tending to another Marine. When I and another man pulled him out of the rubble, his body was limp, his head lolling to the side. And then it happened. As we lifted him, part of his skull gave way and brain matter slipped onto my bare foot. I had taken off my boots earlier to keep the blood and infection from rotting my feet. I stared at the mess on my skin, frozen in shock, while the other Marine screamed at me to keep moving. My stomach lurched. The world spun. For a split second I felt like I was outside my own body, watching a nightmare unfold that I could not escape. I wiped my foot against the dirt, but the image would not leave me. The warmth, the weight, the knowledge that this had once been a man's thoughts, memories, his very life, and now it was just matter clinging to my skin. It made me realize how fragile we were, how thin the barrier between life and death really was. We laid Hammond down near the medic station, but there was nothing they could do. He was gone. I knelt there, drenched in sweat and soot, my rifle still in hand, and felt an emptiness open inside me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry. But there was no time. The battle would not stop to let me grieve. The night dragged on hour after hour, each one heavier than the last. Every time I thought the attack had peaked, another wave hit us. Incendiary grenades rained down, bursting inside artillery pieces and melting steel. The ground shook as more Bangalore torpedoes blew holes in the wire. The air was alive with the whistle of mortars, the roar of flamethrowers, the snapping crack of rifles in the dark. At one point, I pressed myself flat against the dirt, ears ringing, unable to tell if the pounding in my chest was from my own heart or the artillery. I thought of my wife, Tony Jane, back home. Would she ever know what this night was like? Would she ever understand the hell I was living through, or would my memory become just another folded flag handed to a grieving widow? Time lost meaning. Minutes felt like hours. Hours felt like days. Every second was a question. Would I survive the next blast, the next bullet, the next scream? The darkness pressed down, suffocating, broken only by the flashes of death. It was in that darkness, with fire all around and death at every side, that a single thought consumed me. In the darkness, only one thought consumed me: I have to get out of here no matter what it takes. When dawn finally broke over Liberty Bridge, the battlefield looked like another world. The jungle mist clung to the earth, heavy with smoke and the acrid stench of burned fuel, charred wood, and flesh. The night had ended, but the silence that followed was almost worse than the noise. No more explosions, no more rockets, just the faint crackle of dying fires and the groans of the wounded. I sat in the dirt, rifle across my lap, too drained to move. My hands trembled not from adrenaline now, but from exhaustion. My ears rang so loudly that even the quiet felt like a roar. Around me, men slumped against sandbags, their faces pale, their eyes vacant. We were alive, but none of us felt alive. As the sun lifted higher, the scale of the devastation revealed itself. The bunker next to ours was nothing more than a blackened shell, twisted metal and collapsed timbers, with the bodies of Marines inside burned beyond recognition. I forced myself to look, though every instinct told me to turn away. These had been men I had eaten with, laughed with, maybe even shared a cigarette with the night before. Now they were ash and bone, their humanity erased in fire. Beyond the wire, the ground was littered with enemy dead. One lay crushed beneath a tank tread, his body twisted unnaturally, ground into the dirt. Only his thumb remained recognizable as human. I remember staring at it as I chewed on a chocolate bar we called the shit bar, the kind of bitter humor only grunts could invent. The sweetness on my tongue contrasted with the sight before me, and I realized just how callous I had already become. At 21 years old, I had learned to eat lunch next to a mangled corpse and feel nothing but relief that it wasn't me. That realization frightened me more than the enemy did. War had stripped away not only my fear but my compassion. I wondered how much of myself would be left by the time I went home, if I went home at all. The corpsmen moved among the wounded, binding what wounds they could, whispering words of comfort that sounded hollow against the moans of pain. Helicopters came in, their blades chopping the smoky air, carrying out the broken bodies of those who might still be saved. For every man lifted away, another lay still in the dirt, his story finished. I remember one Marine sitting beside me, staring blankly at the horizon. His face was smeared with soot, his hands blackened from gunpowder. I asked if he was okay. He didn't answer. He just kept staring, as if trying to look past the war into a place none of us could reach. In his silence, I recognized my own emptiness. By mid-morning, the camp looked like it had survived an apocalypse. The barbed wire was torn, the artillery pieces warped from heat, the bunkers reduced to smoking ruins. Yet somehow we were still there. We had held the line, if that meant anything. But victory felt meaningless when measured against the cost. I picked up my helmet, brushed the ash from it, and slid it back on my head. It felt heavier than before, as if it carried the weight of every man who hadn't survived the night. The war wasn't over. The war never stopped. Liberty Bridge was just one battle in a chain of endless battles, and I knew there would be more nights like it. Nights when I would wonder if I would live to see the sunrise again. That morning, I realized something that would stay with me for the rest of my life. Surviving was not the same as living. The morning after the battle at Liberty Bridge, I felt like an old man trapped inside the body of someone barely 21. My limbs were heavy, my eyes raw from smoke, my ears still ringing from the night before. Every muscle ached as if my bones had absorbed the shock of each explosion. Yet somehow I was still breathing, still walking among the living. We gathered in what was left of the perimeter. The camp smelled of ash and burnt metal, with traces of blood that clung to the air like rust. The dead had been carried away, the wounded evacuated by helicopters, and what remained was silence, broken only by the occasional cough or the creak of boots moving over dirt. I found myself sitting in the dirt with a chocolate bar in my hand. We called them shit bars, because they were dense, bitter, and tasted more like punishment than comfort. But after a night like that, even a bitter taste felt like luxury. I tore at the wrapper with trembling fingers, chewing slowly, letting the sugar coat the dryness in my throat. For a moment I almost felt human again. That was when I noticed him. Not far from where I sat lay the body of a North Vietnamese soldier. Or rather, what was left of him. A tank had run him over during the chaos of the night, and his body had been mangled beyond recognition. His torso was twisted into the earth, his limbs broken and scattered. Only one detail stood out: the thumb of his right hand sticking out from the dirt, still intact, still human. I stared at that thumb as I chewed my chocolate bar. It was surreal, grotesque, and yet strangely ordinary. A part of me wanted to look away, to feel disgust, to honor the dead with some trace of humanity. But I didn't. Instead, I kept eating, the sweetness mingling with the bitterness of my own callousness. And in that moment I felt something shift inside me. Just a day earlier the sight might have horrified me. I might have felt pity, sorrow, or even revulsion. But after Liberty Bridge, after the fire and the screams, after Hammond's brain matter slipping onto my foot, I felt nothing. Nothing except relief. Relief that it was him lying in the dirt and not me. I sat there longer than I care to admit, chewing that bar, watching the flies gather over the remains of a man who, hours earlier, had been trying to kill me. And I thought to myself, with a coldness that frightened me, "I'm glad it's you and not me." That thought repeated in my mind like a drumbeat. Glad it was him. Glad it wasn't me. It was the most honest thing I had ever admitted, but it stripped me bare. I realized then that the war was reshaping me, carving away pieces of my soul in exchange for survival. Men around me were the same. Some laughed as they cleaned their rifles, making dark jokes about the smell of burning flesh. Others sat in silence, staring into the distance, their faces hollow. We were all different men than we had been the week before. The war had aged us beyond recognition. I wondered what my wife would think if she could see me now, sitting in the dirt, eating chocolate next to a crushed corpse, feeling nothing but relief. Would she recognize me? Would she still see the man she had married, or would she see only the shadow that Vietnam was turning me into? That day, as the sun climbed higher and the heat pressed down, I came to a chilling understanding. It wasn't just bullets and bombs that threatened us. It was the slow erosion of who we were, the gradual decay of our humanity. When death becomes ordinary, we have already lost pieces of our soul. I folded the empty wrapper of the chocolate bar, slipped it into my pocket, and stood up. Around me, life in Delta Company carried on. Men reloading, cleaning gear, preparing for whatever came next. The war didn't pause for reflection. It demanded we keep moving, keep fighting, keep burying the parts of ourselves that made us human. And so I shouldered my rifle, took one last look at the mangled body in the dirt, and walked away. But inside, I knew something had changed. A part of me had died alongside that enemy soldier, and I wasn't sure I would ever get it back. The day I was wounded is etched into my memory as sharply as the shrapnel that tore into my flesh. We had been moving along the outskirts of a village when the ambush came. It started with a grenade, an ugly metallic clink followed by an explosion that threw dirt and smoke into the air. My ears rang as though a bell had been struck inside my skull. When the dust cleared, pain seared through my left leg. A jagged piece of shrapnel had ripped clean through the muscle, burning hot as if it were still on fire. I tried to stand, but my leg buckled under me. Before I could even process the injury, another blast followed. This time, smaller fragments ripped into my stomach. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and for a terrifying moment, I thought my insides were spilling out into the dirt. Then came the concussion. A fellow Marine tripped a booby-trapped grenade just a few yards behind me. The blast hurled me forward, my head cracking against the ground. White light flooded my vision. My thoughts scattered into fragments, faces, sounds, pieces of memory slipping away. When I finally regained focus, I was half-conscious, the world spinning, my ears ringing so loudly I couldn't even hear myself groan. Beside me, another Marine screamed. I turned my head just enough to see that the same blast had caught him worse than it had me. A shard of metal had lodged directly behind his kneecap, leaving his leg mangled and useless. His cries pierced me more than my own wounds did. We were two broken bodies lying side by side in the mud, wondering if we'd ever leave that place alive. Medics came, their faces grim, their hands moving quickly, wrapping bandages, checking pulses. I remember being lifted, my rifle slipping from my hands as they carried me toward the waiting helicopter. The thrum of the rotor blades grew louder, drowning out the chaos below. Dust whipped against my face as they loaded me inside. For the first time since I landed in Vietnam, I felt completely helpless. I wasn't a Marine in that moment. I was just a bleeding man praying to survive the ride. As the helicopter lifted off, I pressed my hand against the bandage on my stomach, feeling the warmth of my own blood seeping through. I stared at the ceiling, trying to stay conscious, whispering silent prayers. Every second stretched longer, and with each jolt of turbulence I thought, this could be it. This could be the last sky I'll ever see. But it wasn't. The chopper carried us to Da Nang Hospital, a place I would come to remember as both a chamber of suffering and, strangely, a place of grace. The hospital in Da Nang was nothing like the quiet, sterile wards you might imagine back home. It was chaos in slow motion, a place where pain had a voice in every corner. The moment I was wheeled inside, the smell struck me first. A heavy mix of blood, iodine, sweat, and something else I can only describe as despair. Rows of cots filled the room, each occupied by a man broken in some way. Some groaned in pain, clutching at missing limbs or bleeding wounds. Others lay silent, eyes staring at the ceiling, their minds already gone though their bodies still clung to life. Nurses and corpsmen moved between them, their hands busy, their faces weary but determined. They laid me down beside the Marine who had been hit worse than me, the one with the knee shattered by shrapnel. His face was pale, his teeth clenched tight as they worked on his leg. Despite his pain, he reached over, touched my arm, and managed a weak smile. No words were exchanged, but I understood. We were alive. That was enough for now. Lying there, I realized how small my world had become. Outside the hospital, the war raged on. Out there, battalions moved, maps shifted, strategies played out. But inside, all that mattered was the next breath, the next heartbeat. The war narrowed to the space of a hospital bed, to the fight to stay conscious, to cling to life for just one more day. The sounds haunted me as much as the sights. Men cried out in the night, calling for their mothers, their wives, their God. Others muttered nonsense, feverish with infection, their words spilling into the hot air like prayers that would never be answered. Every scream, every moan, every whispered goodbye became part of the rhythm of the ward. I remember staring at the ceiling, the paint cracked and yellowed, and thinking how strange it was that life could end beneath such an ordinary view. No glory, no ceremony, just a man bleeding out under a piece of plaster, surrounded by others doing the same. Yet amid the horror there was something else too, a bond. We were all broken, all afraid, but none of us were alone. Every man in that room understood what the other was going through. A nod, a glance, a shared silence, it was enough. In that silence I found strength. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for the men beside me and they for me. The days blurred. Time didn't move the same way inside those walls. Pain carved hours into fragments and morphine stitched them together again. I learned to measure life not in days but in moments. When the pain eased, when a friend survived another surgery, when a familiar face was still there in the morning. It was in that haze, surrounded by blood and sorrow, that something unexpected happened. Something that reminded me there was still a world beyond the war, a world that hadn't forgotten us. It was a few days after my arrival in Da Nang Hospital when the news rippled through the ward. A visitor was coming. At first, none of us paid much attention. Visitors didn't mean much here. The only faces we expected to see were doctors, nurses, and maybe a chaplain. But when the commotion grew louder, I turned my head and saw him. Jimmy Stewart, the actor, the movie star, the man whose voice and stammer had filled movie theaters back home. He didn't walk in like a celebrity. There were no flashing cameras, no stage lights. He came quietly alongside his wife, dressed simply, but carrying with him an air that made every head turn. For a moment, the ward was hushed, as if the war itself had paused to let him enter. I couldn't believe my eyes. Here we were, lying in sweat-soaked sheets, wrapped in bandages, half-drugged on morphine, and Jimmy Stewart, the man who had been on screens across America, was standing just a few feet away. For a second, I felt as though I had been transported back home, back to a time before Vietnam, when life was simpler, when my greatest worry was making rent or getting to work on time. When he reached my bed, he leaned down, his face lined with age and kindness. He did that familiar stutter, the one that had made him so beloved, and asked, "W, where did you get hit, son?" His voice wasn't an act. It was real, human, full of concern. I told him about the shrapnel in my leg, the piece lodged in my stomach, the concussion that left me half-deaf. He listened as though my story mattered more than anything else in the world. His wife smiled gently beside him, her eyes soft and warm, as if she carried enough compassion for all the broken men in that room. Around me, other Marines lifted their heads, their faces lighting up with something I hadn't seen in weeks: hope. For a few minutes, we weren't just patients or casualties, or statistics in a war that seemed to swallow everything. We were young men being recognized, being seen by someone who represented the world we had left behind. I will never forget that moment. Not because Jimmy Stewart was famous, but because he reminded us we were still human. He didn't bring medicine or supplies, but he brought something rarer: dignity. His presence told us that we weren't forgotten, that someone still cared enough to look us in the eye and call us sons. As he moved down the row of beds, shaking hands, offering words, I felt a strange warmth settle over me. It wasn't the morphine. It wasn't relief from pain. It was something deeper, something I hadn't felt in months: humanity. And in that place filled with blood and pain, surrounded by men who had lost limbs, lost friends, lost hope, a movie star gave us something we didn't even know we needed. In that place filled with blood and pain, a movie star brought me a flicker of humanity. That memory has stayed with me longer than the scars, longer than the nightmares. Because in war, the smallest acts of kindness shine brighter than all the darkness. Coming home was supposed to feel like freedom. The plane landed on American soil, and the air smelled different, cleaner, calmer, filled with the sounds of a world that had not been touched by the jungles of Vietnam. Families waved flags, children laughed, music played on radios. But for me, it all felt foreign, as though I had stepped into a world that no longer belonged to me. I walked through the airport in my uniform, duffel bag slung over my shoulder, and expected something. Gratitude maybe. Recognition. Instead, there were stares, some cold, some pitying, some openly hostile. People whispered the word Vietnam like it was a disease, like I had brought something shameful back with me. The war wasn't popular, and neither were we. At home, my wife tried to make things normal again. She cooked meals, asked about my day, smiled when I managed to laugh. But the truth was, I wasn't really there. My body sat at the dinner table, but my mind was still halfway across the world, crouched in a foxhole, gripping an M16 in the dark. At night, I woke up drenched in sweat, the echoes of gunfire still ringing in my ears. I'd look around the room, heart racing, only to realize I was safe. At least physically. The faces of my brothers in arms haunted me more than anything. Hammond, the corpsman whose life ended in my hands. The Marines burned alive in the bunker at Liberty Bridge. The kid with the scalp tied to his helmet, already lost to the madness of it all. And the nameless enemy soldier crushed beneath the tank, whose thumb still lingers in my memory whenever I close my eyes. They followed me into my sleep, into my quiet moments, into every attempt at peace. I tried to bury it, to act like the past was gone. I got a job, mowed the lawn, went to church. People would say, "You're lucky you made it back." And yes, I was lucky, but I didn't feel lucky. I felt broken. Every sudden noise made me jump. Every crowded room felt like an ambush. And no matter how much I wanted to believe I was home, a part of me stayed in Vietnam, crouched in the mud, waiting for the next explosion. My body left the war, but my mind has been trapped there ever since. The years rolled on, but the war never really ended for men like me. The battles replayed themselves in the quiet hours of the night, uninvited and unstoppable. I'd wake gasping for breath, convinced I was back under fire. My wife would hold me, whispering that it was just a dream, but I knew better. It wasn't a dream, it was a memory refusing to die. Some of my brothers couldn't bear it. They came home with the same invisible wounds, the same ghosts clinging to their shoulders, but without the strength to carry them. Too many of them turned to the bottle, to drugs, to silence. Some ended it themselves, leaving behind families who could never understand what haunted them. I understood. I understood too well. Sleep was rare. Peace was rarer. I learned to live with the tension, the constant hum of anxiety that followed me like a shadow. In conversations, I drifted. In crowds, I shut down. In moments that should have brought joy, I felt nothing but numbness. I had survived, yes, but survival came with a price. What the war left behind were scars no doctor could stitch shut. They were not visible like the ones on my leg or stomach. These were deeper, buried inside where no one could see them. And in many ways, those were the scars that hurt the most. Because people expect wounds to heal. They don't expect a man to carry the war inside him for the rest of his life. Yet even in the darkness, I tried to hold on to small lights. A child's laugh. A friend's smile. A quiet Sunday morning where the world felt safe, even if just for an hour. Those moments reminded me I was still human, still capable of something beyond survival. But the truth never left me. Vietnam was not just a chapter of my life. It became a prison of memory. A place where too many of us still live, long after we've left its jungles behind. As the years have passed, I've come to realize that survival is more than just staying alive. It's about finding meaning in the fact that you're still here when so many others are not. Every scar I carry, visible or invisible, is a reminder that I walked away from a place where thousands never did. And for that, I thank God every single day. Faith has been my anchor. When the memories come back, when the nightmares shake me awake, I remind myself that there must be a reason I am still breathing. Perhaps it is to tell these stories. Perhaps it is to make sure the world never forgets the price that was paid by the young men who fought and died far from home. To my fellow veterans who are still struggling, I know the weight you carry. I know the darkness that follows you, whispering that there is no escape. But hear me, there is a way forward. Let go. Breathe. Trust that life can still hold beauty. The war may have taken pieces of us, but it does not have to take the rest. The world needs your story. Every scar, every memory, every tear you've shed, they matter. Don't bury them in silence. Share them so that others may understand, so that the next generation may learn not from textbooks but from the voices of those who lived it. Above all, I hold on to a hope. A hope that one day war will not be the measure of a generation. That one day young men and women will not have to bury their youth in foreign soil. That one day peace will not be a dream but a reality. When I look back on Vietnam, I no longer see only the blood and the fire. I see the faces of men who taught me courage, loyalty, and sacrifice. I see the moments of kindness that broke through the chaos. A hand reaching out, a smile shared in the mud, a word of comfort whispered in the dark. And I see the blessings of survival, not because I deserved it more than others, but because I was given the chance to carry their memory forward. So this is my message: cherish life. Hold tight to the people you love. And never forget the cost of freedom, because it is written in the names of those who never came home. I walked through hell so I could tell you today, live for those who never had the chance. If my story has reached you, if even a single moment in these memories touched your heart, I ask you for one thing: keep the memory alive. Share your own story, whether you are a veteran, a family member, or simply someone who believes history should never be forgotten. And if you believe these voices matter, help us spread them. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to this channel so that these memories will not fade with time. Every click, every share, every new voice joining this community keeps the flame alive. Because in the end, memory is the only victory we can claim over war. By remembering we honor. By sharing we heal. By living we give meaning to those who no longer can.